the man who portrayed the Lone Ranger, Clayton Moore, the man who dedicated his life and career to upholding the images and the principles for which...
For millions of Americans growing up in the 1940s and 1950s, the image of the brave masked rider galloping across the screen was unforgettable. The character of the Lone Ranger stood for honor, justice, courage, and loyalty. When people heard the words, "Hi-yo, Silver," they instantly thought of one man, Clayton Moore. To children watching in black and white television sets, he was not simply an actor. He was the Lone Ranger. But while the hero on screen always won the fight and rode off into the sunset, the real story behind the man wearing the mask was far more complicated. His life was not filled with gunfights and outlaws, but with business battles, identity struggles, disappointment, and deep personal loyalty to a role that both made and limited him. This is the story of a man who loved a character so deeply that he became trapped inside it. It is a story about fame, loss, pride, and persistence. And while Clayton Moore may have played one of television's greatest heroes, his real life was shaped not by simple victories, but by emotional tests that were far more difficult than anything written in a script. Long before he ever put on a mask, Clayton Moore was a young boy growing up in Chicago with energy and athletic talent. He was strong, agile, and full of confidence. As a teenager, he became deeply involved in gymnastics and acrobatics. He even performed as part of an aerial troupe at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. His early life showed a pattern that would follow him forever. He was disciplined, physical, and willing to work hard without complaint. After high school, he moved into modeling because of his striking good looks and strong presence. From modeling, he slowly moved toward acting. The journey was not easy. Hollywood in the late 1930s was competitive and often harsh. Moore did not immediately become a star. In fact, he struggled. Studios were unsure of his acting ability, though they agreed he looked impressive on camera. He took small roles, worked in Western serials, and performed many of his own stunts. Unlike today's stars, actors in those days often helped move equipment and worked long hours in rough outdoor conditions. There were no luxury trailers waiting on set. Clayton Moore built his career step by step, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through steady work and determination. The Lone Ranger character itself had already become famous before Moore ever stepped into the role. The hero first appeared on radio in 1933, created by producer George Trendle and writer Fran Stryker. On the radio, the character's voice became legendary, especially through actor Brace Beamer, who gave the Lone Ranger a deep and commanding sound. The mask was originally designed for a practical reason, so that if one actor left, another could easily replace him. The character was meant to be bigger than any single performer. When television began rising in popularity after World War II, producers decided to bring the Lone Ranger to the screen. Clayton Moore won the role after competing against dozens of other actors. He had the physical strength, the strong jawline, and the heroic posture needed for the part. But there was concern about whether he could match the powerful radio voice that audiences already loved. Moore practiced lowering his voice, even speaking into corners of rooms to deepen his tone. From the beginning, he took the responsibilities seriously. He did not treat the role like just another job. He believed in the Lone Ranger's moral code, known as the Lone Ranger Creed, which spoke about fairness, equality, courage, and faith. For Moore, this was not just dialogue, it became personal. When the television series premiered in 1949 on ABC, it quickly became one of the most popular shows in America. Alongside Jay Silverheels, who portrayed Tonto, Moore created a partnership that audiences loved. The show's success was remarkable. At one point, the Lone Ranger appeared across multiple networks through television and radio broadcasts. Children admired him. Parents respected him. Merchandising exploded. Lunchboxes, masks, toys, and costumes filled stores. However, this is where the story begins to grow more complicated. While the character earned enormous money through products, Clayton Moore did not receive profits from most of this merchandise. The rights belonged largely to George Trendle. Unlike other Western stars such as Roy Rogers or Gene Autry, who owned their own names and brands, Moore was simply playing a character owned by others. He loved the role deeply, but legally, he did not control it. This difference would later become a painful source of conflict. After 2 seasons, Moore was suddenly fired. The decision shocked fans. Because the character wore a mask, producers believed they could replace the actor without much trouble. Actor John Hart was brought in to take over the role. But audiences quickly noticed the difference. Even with the mask, viewers sensed that something was missing. Ratings dropped. Letters poured in asking for the real Lone Ranger. Eventually, Moore was rehired. This return felt like a victory, but it also revealed something important. Moore had become deeply tied to the character in a way that producers had not expected. For him, being fired was not simply losing a job. It felt like losing part of his identity. Yet he returned without bitterness, ready to work again. He continued playing the Lone Ranger until the series ended in 1957. By then, he had fully embraced the character not just as a role, but as a lifelong mission. And the years after the show ended, Moore made a choice that shaped the rest of his life. While many actors try to escape roles that define them, he did the opposite. He continued appearing in public as the Lone Ranger, wearing the mask at parades, events, and children's hospitals. He believed children deserved to see their hero in real life. However, when a new Lone Ranger movie was produced in the early 1980s, the studio behind the legend of the Lone Ranger sued Moore to prevent him from wearing the mask in public appearances. The legal battle lasted years. During that time, Moore wore large sunglasses shaped like the mask to continue maintaining the image fans expected. The lawsuit hurt him deeply. He felt he was not harming the brand but honoring it. Eventually, after changes in studio leadership, the case was dropped. Moore was allowed to wear the mask again. When he appeared on television during this period, audiences gave him standing ovations. It was clear that to many Americans, he was the Lone Ranger. No matter what contracts said, one of the most surprising chapters of Moore's life connects him briefly to one of America's darkest stories. In 1969, he visited Spahn Ranch, where parts of the Lone Ranger had once been filmed. At the time, the ranch was being used by members of the Manson family, led by Charles Manson. Moore and his daughter visited the ranch without knowing who was living there. They met George Spahn, the elderly owner, and left safely. Only months later, the Manson murders shocked the nation. Years afterward, director Quentin Tarantino recreated a version of this visit in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. For Moore's family, seeing a private memory appear in a major film was surreal. It added yet another unexpected layer to the life of a man already connected to American pop culture history. Clayton Moore's real story was not filled with scandals or crimes. It was not unheroic in a dramatic sense. Instead, it was human. He struggled with contracts, business misunderstandings, and the limits of typecasting. He sacrificed a broader acting career because he believed in one role more than chasing variety. Some might say he allowed himself to be defined too narrowly. Others would say he showed rare loyalty and integrity. In the end, Moore lived many more years after the height of the show's fame, continuing to appear as the Lone Ranger until his death in 1999. For him, the mask was never just fabric. It was a symbol of values he truly believed in: fairness, courage, faith, and service. While the television hero always rode into the sunset untouched by doubt, the real man behind the mask lived through rejection, lawsuits, and the difficult balance between identity and career. His story reminds us that sometimes the greatest challenge is not defeating villains, but deciding who you are when the costume comes off. Clayton Moore's connection to the Lone Ranger was not something that faded with time. In fact, as television moved into color and new shows began to capture public attention, Moore continued holding tightly to the image that had made him famous. For many actors, this kind of attachment would feel like a trap. Hollywood often rewards reinvention. Stars are expected to move from one role to another, showing range and flexibility. But Moore did not follow that path. Instead of chasing new dramatic parts or trying to escape his past, he leaned fully into it. He visited schools, charity events, rodeos, and public gatherings dressed in the full costume. Children who had only seen reruns on television were thrilled to meet him in person. Parents who had grown up with the show felt a deep wave of nostalgia when they saw him. For Moore, these appearances were not simply business opportunities. He believed he was giving something meaningful back to the public. He once explained that children needed heroes, especially heroes who stood for honesty and courage. He did not see himself as pretending. In his mind, the values of the Lone Ranger were values he tried to live by every day. This strong identification, however, came with a cost. While Moore enjoyed admiration, he also faced the problem of typecasting. Casting directors often saw him only as the Lone Ranger and could not imagine him in other roles. Unlike some actors who fight against being remembered for one character, Moore seemed almost comfortable with that limitation. Yet behind the scenes, it meant that his acting career outside of the Lone Ranger never fully developed. He appeared in a few films and television shows, sometimes playing villains, but audiences struggled to separate him from the masked hero. This created a strange situation. He was extremely famous, yet at the same time limited. He was widely recognized, yet professionally boxed in. Some critics later argued that he could have pushed harder to expand his range. Others believe he understood his strengths and made a practical decision to focus on what worked. Either way, his career shows how fame can both lift a person up and quietly close other doors. Another important part of Moore's story is his relationship with co-star Jay Silverheels. Silverheels, a Canadian Mohawk actor, brought dignity and strength to the role of Tonto. Their partnership on screen felt balanced and respectful, especially during a time when Native American characters were often portrayed unfairly in Hollywood. Behind the scenes, Silverheels also demonstrated courage. During early filming, conditions were difficult. Long hours, little comfort, and minimal support from producers created frustration. At one point, Silverheels protested the treatment and halted production until improvements were made. Moore initially tried to keep the peace, but ultimately supported his co-star. This moment showed that Moore's loyalty was not limited to a fictional creed. He valued fairness and respect in real life as well. Their friendship lasted for decades, and Moore spoke warmly of Silverheels long after the show ended. Their on-screen chemistry reflected genuine mutual respect, which helped the series feel authentic. The legal battle over the mask in the late 1970s and early 1980s remains one of the most dramatic chapters in Moore's life. When producers of The Legend of the Lone Ranger moved forward with a new adaptation, they wanted to separate the character from Moore's public appearances. They believed allowing him to continue wearing the mask could confuse audiences and weaken the new film's marketing. From a business point of view, this argument made sense. From Moore's point of view, it felt like betrayal. For decades, he had helped keep the character alive in the public's imagination. He had never acted against the brand's interests. In fact, many fans still connected the character to him personally. Being told to stop wearing the mask felt like being told to erase part of his identity. During the lawsuit, Moore chose a creative response. He began wearing large wraparound sunglasses shaped similarly to the mask. It was both humorous and symbolic, a quiet protest without anger. The public largely sided with him. When the 1981 film failed at the box office, many observers felt it proved that the Lone Ranger's image was still strongly tied to Moore. It is important to understand that Moore's attachment to the character was not simply stubbornness. It reflected a deeper question that many performers face. Where does the character end and the person begin? Over time, the line can blur. For Moore, the Lone Ranger was not just fiction. The creed of fairness, honesty, and service became something he tried to follow personally. In interviews, he often spoke about faith, kindness, and treating others with dignity. Friends described him as polite, humble, and generous. Yet critics sometimes suggested that he allowed nostalgia to define him too strongly. They wondered if he missed opportunities to evolve. This debate continues even today. Was he wisely protecting a legacy, or was he unable to let go? The answer may be somewhere in between. Human identity is rarely simple. For Moore, the mask was both protection and limitation. The unexpected connection to the Manson story, later dramatized in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, added a strange layer of modern relevance to Moore's life. In the film, a tense scene recreates a visit to Spawn Ranch, where Moore had once filmed episodes of the series. Although the real-life visit happened before the infamous crimes took place, The connection felt chilling in hindsight. For Moore's daughter, seeing a private family memory portrayed on screen decades later was surreal. It reminded audiences that even figures associated with simple black-and-white television adventures were connected, in unexpected ways, to the larger and sometimes darker history of America. Moore's life touched both the innocence of 1950s family television and the unsettling realities of the late 1960s. In the end, Clayton Moore passed away in 1999 at the age of 85. By that time, he had spent more than half a century linked to one character. For some actors, that might feel like a narrow legacy. For Moore, it seemed enough. He believed he had been given a role that mattered to people. He understood that the Lone Ranger stood for clear moral values in a world that often feels complicated. His real story may not include dramatic scandals or shocking secrets, but it does include difficult lessons about ownership, loyalty, identity, and pride. It shows how fame can bring admiration while also limiting growth. It shows how business decisions can shape personal destiny. And it shows how a man can choose to embrace the mask rather than run from it. Clayton Moore may not have fought real outlaws, but he faced legal battles, career challenges, and the pressure of public expectation. In that sense, his real life required courage of a different kind, the quiet courage to remain true to what he believed, even when the world around him changed. As the decades passed and television continued to evolve, the image of the Lone Ranger slowly moved from primetime excitement to nostalgic memory. New generations grew up with different heroes, different shows, and more complex stories. Yet, even as entertainment changed, Clayton Moore continued to appear at Western film festivals, charity events, and autograph signings. At gatherings celebrating classic television and film, he was often one of the most recognized faces in the room. Fans would approach him not simply to collect a signature, but to thank him. Many told him that watching the Lone Ranger as children had shaped their sense of right and wrong. Some shared stories of difficult childhoods where the simple message of the show gave them comfort. For Moore, these conversations mattered deeply. They reinforced his belief that the character was more than entertainment. He understood that in a time before violent anti-heroes and complicated moral gray areas, the Lone Ranger represented a clear moral compass. The hero did not drink, cheat, or seek revenge. He stood for fairness and believed in the law. Moore felt proud to have represented those values during a time when America was rebuilding after war and facing social change. At the same time, cultural attitudes were shifting. By the 1970s and 1980s, audiences were drawn to more flawed characters. Western films became darker and more realistic. Stories began exploring moral uncertainty instead of simple good versus evil battles. In this changing landscape, the Lone Ranger sometimes felt old-fashioned. Critics argued that the character belonged to a simpler era. Moore, however, did not see these values as outdated. He believed honesty and courage never lose